This is the report of the Regulations Review Committee into the inquiry into COVID-19 secondary legislation. This was a very painful time for many people in New Zealand, a very painful time when they felt, in some cases, disunited or excluded. This is time for us to bring people back together, and I believe that the role of the Regulations Review Committee in our report is something that will give people heart. We do not review policy, but we do look at the secondary legislation and to see if it is made in accordance with its empowering provision and consistently within constitutional principles. I think one of the things that impressed me the most was how poorly some government ministries and departments actually took the role of providing good secondary legislation and then complying with the constitutional arrangements seriously. Now, I understand, and I think we can all acknowledge, that in many cases the Ministry of Health, the main agency in this, was under an extreme amount of stress, that they were dealing with a situation that they had not seen before, certainly not in the lifetimes of the Director-General or others, and that they were rushing. The problem is, and I'm sure that members, when they wish to read the report, will understand, is that if the legislation, secondary legislation, is being drafted by ministries themselves rather than Parliamentary Council Office, there is often not the expertise in a ministry to be able to draft clearly and within the rules that are expected of legal drafting. And that was really clear. When I think to the criticism of the COVID-19 Response Vaccination Legislation Act, which was actually introduced on the 23rd of November 2021 and had its first, second and third readings on the same day, that bill received royal assent 2 days later on the 25th of November, and that was actually really almost 2 years after the full first brunt of the pandemic had hit us. That bill did not go to a select committee, it did not go to regulations review, it was not given the sort of scrutiny that people should expect. And I think it would be wrong to say that there was urgency. Parliament's Attorney-General criticised it at the time by saying it should have been sent to a select committee. He was right. It should have been. It wasn't. And instead what we see in that legislation is that it actually referred to, and the regulations coming from it, referred to all sorts of terms that are unknown at law. It was legislation that might have been drafted by the communications team. It was simply not up to scratch, and nor were the regulations from it. And there's a big problem with that, apart from the quality of drafting. And that big problem is, where does one find it? What tends to happen is it's put on the website of that ministry or that department. Or not. It might not be put there. Or if it is, it might be unclear. All regulations, all secondary legislation where people can be subjected to rules should be in one place. And we know that ignorance of the law is no excuse at law. But if you can't even find the legislation, the law that you're accused of having breached, how could you possibly be found guilty under it? And the answer is, I think we're quite lucky not to have had more court cases on this, because, frankly, I think if we were not in a pandemic situation, there would have been more cases on this. Regulations should not be made willy-nilly of whether or not they're authorised by the primary legislation. It has to follow a format, and there's a reason. It's not because we're being I can't even say it now. It's not because we're being difficult about it. It's actually because this matters. Law matters. Parliament matters. And we cannot simply continue down a path of ministries and departments deciding they'll have the law that they'd quite like, and that's really going to spin well. Come back to the law. Thank you.